In 1279 BC, Ramesses II, whose name remains well known today, came the ruler of Egypt. At the time, however, much of the known world had no idea who he was, or even that Egypt existed. Similarly, Ramesses and his people were aware of only a small portion of the outside world. Though their knowledge was greater than that of earlier generations just a few centuries before, some members of his royal court were aware of the peoples and lands that this book will explore. They had either met travelers from regions stretching from Nubia in the south to the Black Sea in the north, and from the Greek mainland to western Irano they had traveled to these places themselves. But beyond those areas, their knowledge was minimal. They may have come across objects from sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, or Atlantic Europe, but they knew nothing about the people who made them. Even for modern historians, the world in 1279 BC is largely unknown and unknowable. Most of the globe's inhabitants left behind very little for us to study. Countless communities at the time hadn't yet developed agriculture or settled ways of living. Among those who had, only a few lived in cities, and fewer still used writing. The traces of their lives are scarce and difficult to interpret. Archaeologists have managed to reconstruct some aspects of life during the 13th century BC. But we usually don't know what these people called themselves or what languages they spoke. At best, we only have a vague outline of their material existence. In many cases, even those traces are missing, since nomadic lifestyles left no permanent marks for archaeologists to find. Generally speaking, the more developed and complex a society was, especially in terms of technology and material culture, the more likely it is that we can find evidence of its existence today. By the latter half of the second millennium BC, only 3 regions in the world had developed complex societies with cities, social hierarchies, and economies that extended beyond basic survival. These cultures had grown independently in different parts of the world, and our understanding of them varies widely. In Central America, the Olmec civilization was just beginning to emerge. It would reach its peak only after 1200 BC, slightly beyond the scope of this study. Located along the southern Gulf Coast of Mexico, the Olmecs practiced agriculture and lived in early urban settlements, though they had not yet developed writing. Around 1250 BC, they began building large structures that would later become important ceremonial centers. Despite some modern theories, the Olmecs had no contact with civilizations across the Atlantic or Pacific. They created their culture entirely on their own. The other 2 advanced civilizations of the time were located on opposite sides of Asia, just south of the Central Asian steppes and deserts, and north of the Indian Ocean and Arabian Peninsula. These cultures existed as small pockets of development in the vast Eurasian landscape, surrounded by nomadic or village-based populations. Although there may have been indirect contact between them, it's unlikely that the people of either region knew the other existed. Today, historians have very different levels of access to each. In East Asia, the Shang dynasty and the Middle Yellow River Valley began using writing around 1200 BC. The written records that survive are limited to inscriptions on oracle bones and bronze vessels, mostly listing royal names or isolated events. However, the archaeological record is rich. Fortified towns, grand tombs, and large buildings. Still, our understanding of the Shang period largely depends on much later Chinese historical texts, and the inscriptions we have mainly confirm what those later sources say about early kings in Western Asia. The situation was entirely different. Along the eastern Mediterranean coast, several highly developed cultures coexisted. They left behind a wealth of written records, visual art, and archaeological evidence, allowing historians to study them in great detail. This was the world that Ramesses II and his court were familiar with. It included powerful states that matched Egypt in status and are now well known to us. Hatti, the land of the Hittites in Anatolia and northern Syria, Babylonia in southern Iraq, and Assyria in northern Iraq and eastern Syria. Beyond them lay the Mycenaean civilization of the Aegean in Greece and the Elamite kingdom of southwestern Iran. Smaller states also existed along the western Anatolian coast, in the Levant, and on Cyprus. Northern Syria had previously been united under the kingdom of Mitanni. These societies were often urban, built monumental structures, and engaged in significant economic and cultural activities. They left behind extensive written and material records. We know the names of many people from these regions, the languages they spoke, their professions, their deities, and much more. This level of insight is extraordinarily rare for the time period. If we imagine the ancient world as a dark globe, only lit where history has left a record, the Eastern Mediterranean is the one clearly visible area. It is no surprise that historical narratives often describe this region as the cradle of civilization. This book will focus on the Eastern Mediterranean world. It's crucial to recognize how exceptional this region was, surrounded as it was by vast territories we still know little about, though these outer regions may seem disconnected. Events there had real impacts on the more documented societies of the Mediterranean. Our understanding of these outer regions is mostly indirect, based on later parallels or brief moments when their people interacted with the Mediterranean world or traded with it. Immersed in what the historical record reveals, we can easily forget how much remains unseen. We may think we're talking about the world, but in truth we're only looking at a small, illuminated corner of an otherwise vast and largely unknown past. A history without events, the cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean can be examined in many different ways, as shown by the large body of scholarly work already devoted to them. The wide range of available sources allows for detailed political, social, economic, diplomatic, cultural, and religious histories are focused on individual societies or examining multiple cultures and their interactions. One defining feature of this region during this time was its strong sense of internationalism. The various states, though it would be inaccurate to call them nations, were aware of each other and maintained frequent diplomatic and commercial contact. Many rulers viewed themselves as part of a broader system where participants were ranked. In a kind of hierarchy, the level of interaction among these states, as far as we can tell today, is unmatched in the ancient world. This has led scholars to focus intensely on the region, especially from a political angle. There is a wealth of analysis, for example, on how Egypt managed its relationships with the Syro-Palestinian states under its control, and how internal political events in Egypt shaped those relations. Similarly, the rivalry between Babylonia and Assyria for dominance has been studied closely. With much attention given to the decisions of individual kings, these political studies are essential, and the insights they provide inform every part of this book. However, my focus will be different. Rather than centering on the actions of rulers, merchants, soldiers, or farmers, I aim to examine the broader system that shaped and sustained their world, often beyond their awareness. Each state's natural environment, economy, and social structures influence not just that individual society, but also contributed to the functioning of a larger, interconnected system. At a certain level, these societies were variations on a shared condition, each part necessary to the survival of the whole. History can be approached at different levels of abstraction. In this book, I'll avoid focusing on isolated individuals or unique events. Instead, I'll explore the common elements that made this period stand out in the ancient world. Specific events such as battles or treaties won't be the central focus, because none of them, on their own, fundamentally changed the system. Rather, each event serves as a window into how the system worked and how it responded to internal and external pressures. This type of history is aligned with what the French historian Fernand Braudel called social history. My approach is inspired by his famous study of the Mediterranean in the time of Spain's Philip II. I've borrowed his title style for this book deliberately. Structuralism and Orientalism revived. Is it still valid in our postmodern era to seek out underlying systems across diverse people and cultures in a broad geographical space? Could such an approach be criticized for imposing patterns or similarities that ignore the unique situations of different groups and individuals? And by echoing the title of a 16th century history, am I suggesting that time in the Eastern Mediterranean stood still? Am I unintentionally repeating old Orientalist stereotypes that describe the Middle East as unchanging? These are valid concerns for a project like this. There are many ways to study history, each with its own value and perspective. Whether a historian emphasizes the unique over the general depends on what they aim to uncover. On a single individual or small community can be fascinating. But how often can a historian working on the ancient world access enough information to reconstruct the life and thoughts of an individual? One reason we know about the beliefs of a 16th century miller from Friuli, for instance, is because they were so unusual that they drew the attention of an inquisition obsessed with keeping records. In ancient history, focusing on individuals often means writing about kings. Ramesses II, for example, has been the subject of several books. Other rulers from his time, though fewer in number, could also be studied in detail, thanks to the available evidence. But where does that leave the rest of the population? Archaeologists rightly remind us that everyday people can be studied through material remains. In some cases, we also have texts that shed light on their lives. Tombs from Egypt's New Kingdom, for example, offer a wealth of information across a wide social spectrum, from royal family members to what might be called the middle class. Personal archives discovered in various cities around the region also reveal details about business and daily life. These individuals deserve study, and where possible, their stories should be told. Still, the opportunities to work at that level of detail are rare. More often, we are left with scattered bits of evidence that mean little on their own. As a result, historians frequently have to step back from individuals and look at the broader picture. This has led to the dominance of what we might anachronistically call national history, such as New Kingdom Egypt, the Hittite Empire, or Kassite Babylonia. These works combine information about rulers and everyday people to offer a general portrait of a society during a specific period. This approach is both reasonable and necessary, especially given the limitations of the evidence. Historians can also take an even broader step back, disregarding the boundaries between states entirely. This brings us to a higher level of abstraction, where individual events are less important. This means sacrificing some attention to individual experiences, but it also allows for greater understanding. Because interpreting specific actions or events without a broader context is impossible. How can we fully grasp the history of a state like New Kingdom Egypt without referencing broader concepts of how ancient states functioned? The way we explain the past both to ourselves and to others inevitably draws on larger frameworks, shaped by existing interpretations. Unfortunately, these frameworks often rely too heavily on assumptions from past scholars and can be tainted by outdated, biased, or even racist ideas. That's why these structures must constantly be reassessed and refined. Working at this broad level does, admittedly, simplify the complexity of lived experience. But the belief that one can truly understand a single historical event or individual without referring to a wider context is simply not true. And what of the stereotype of an unchanging Middle East? By referencing Brodel's 16th century Mediterranean study, I'm not suggesting that the Eastern Mediterranean stayed frozen in time. Rather, I'm adopting a similar method and focus. That said, some aspects of life, particularly those tied to the natural environment, did remain consistent across centuries. Brodel proposed that history unfolds on different timescales, and one of them operates at a pace closer to geology than to human history. Human interaction with nature through farming, seafaring, and basic survival remained remarkably stable. Throughout the pre-industrial age, even with changes in climate, these patterns held on for thousands of years. In fact, some of the same dynamics Brodel observed for the 16th century were already in place by the 13th century BC still. Much had changed in terms of political structures, culture, religion, and economies. The world of Ramesses II was vastly different from that of Philip II. I don't claim the two eras were fundamentally alike. Rather, I argue that they can be studied using similar historical approaches. Setting limits, how do we decide where the boundaries lie, when to begin and end the story, which regions to include, and which to leave out? Historians are always dependent on their sources, which are unevenly distributed across time and geography. Still, from the outset, we can say that the Eastern Mediterranean world was dominated by literate cultures. The presence of writing is a key indicator that a society was part of the interconnected system that this book explores. The existence of written records suggests that these societies had hierarchical structures, complex economies, and sufficient development to support written communication. While all of them went through periods with little or no writing, and while most of their populations remained illiterate, the fact that writing existed at all places them within the scope of this study. These texts reflect the workings of their societies and link them to others through shared diplomatic and economic networks. Writing, then, sets the basic limits of this history, even though archaeological and non-written sources are also crucial to understanding the period, of course. Any boundary defined by a single criterion like writing is going to be flexible. A single discovery, such as a cache of texts, could reshape our picture entirely, extending the time frame or geographical scope. Fortunately, the kind of history explored here focused on long-term structures and patterns rather than political events is more tolerant of such uncertainties. We're not concerned with pinpointing exact dates when things began or ended, rather with identifying broad trends and shared developments. This study focuses on the second half of the second millennium BC, though the exact dates are fluid and can vary depending on local developments. The starting point is especially vague. In different regions, societies entered the historical record at different times between the 16th and 14th centuries BC. For example, in Babylonia, kings in the 14th century began commissioning inscriptions that confirmed their existence, names that previously appeared only in much later king lists. The stability provided by the ruling dynasty enabled economic growth, which in turn generated the bureaucracy that produced more records. That's when we begin to see more evidence of economic life. In Egypt, writing never completely disappeared, even during the so-called Second Intermediate Period. But at that time, it was limited to short inscriptions, and the volume of records was tiny compared to what we find in the 15th to 13th centuries. In mainland Greece, on the other hand, written records don't appear until very late in the period, and even then, they're limited in both use and content. For that region, archaeological data becomes our main source, allowing us to say that the culture under study began forming around 1600 BC. As for the end of the period, many associate it with the widespread upheaval around 1200 BCA time, when many societies in the Aegean and the Levant experienced sudden and dramatic collapse. Cities and palaces in Greece, Crete, Anatolia, and coastal Syrio-Palestine were destroyed, abruptly ending many established systems. However, not every part of the eastern Mediterranean was affected the same way. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, there was decline, but no sudden collapse. Ruling dynasties held on for another century or more. Political historians of those regions don't typically draw a hard line at 1200, but it's clear that signs of decline were already apparent, and that what followed marked the closing phase of a broader era. Even in regions like Syrio-Palestine, where some states survived the 1200 crisis, they entered a long, gradual decline. By around 1100 BC, nearly the entire eastern Mediterranean world except for Egypt had abandoned writing, or at least left no surviving written records. To define the spatial boundaries of this world, it's helpful to start from the core and move outward. Once again, writing acts as our primary guide. The core region includes a crescent-shaped zone stretching from southern Babylonia to southern Egypt. This area encompasses Babylonia, Syria, northern Syria, central Anatolia, the Syro-Palestinian coast, and the Nile Valley from the delta to Upper Nubia. In all these places, writing was widely used. Bordering this core were regions where writing was present but less common, or used in more limited ways, such as western Iran to the east and the Aegean world to the west. Despite being on the margins, these regions were still connected to the core through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. The Babylonians, for example, had contact with areas along the Persian Gulf, the Assyrians with eastern Anatolia and northwest Iran, the Hittites with regions farther north and west, the Mycenaeans with Italy and Mediterranean islands, and the Egyptians with Libya and territories to the south and east of Nubia. How far these connections extended is difficult to say. Some scholars have proposed a far-reaching world system stretching across Eurasia with the eastern Mediterranean as its hub. But this view likely overstates the case. Direct contact with regions beyond natural barriers like the Alps, the Caucasus, the Hindu Kush, the Sahara, and the Arabian deserts was probably rare. That said, not everyone in these core regions was literate or part of sedentary urban life. Every state included large populations who lived outside the centers of political and cultural power. People we know only through limited archaeological evidence or the passing mentions in the writings of others. These groups are often silent. In the historical record, not because they were unimportant, but because they left behind fewer material traces and have been less studied by modern archaeologists. Yet they played a critical role in this era and may even have been decisive in bringing it to an end. For that reason, this book will pay close attention to these often overlooked groups by carefully examining the limited and biased evidence that survives. We can still begin to piece together a picture of their lives and their impact on the world around them. Writing as a parameter, I've chosen to use the presence of writing as a key criterion for deciding which periods and regions to include in this study. But is that a reasonable choice? After all, in antiquity, writing was a skill held by only a small portion of the population, and much of what was written during the 2nd millennium BC has either been lost over time or remains undiscovered. Moreover, writing is only one element of culture. Would it not make more sense to rely on other indicators like the level of urbanization, which can be assessed more consistently through archaeology and are less dependent on the chance survival of documents? Even so, I believe that focusing on written material is justified for two main reasons. First, this is a work of history, and historical research fundamentally depends on written sources. While archaeological and geographical data are essential, it's the texts left behind by these societies that give us the clearest context and understanding of their world. Second, although writing was known in many parts of the eastern Mediterranean, as early as the late 4th or early 3rd millennium BC, its use wasn't constant across time or place. In regions like Mesopotamia and Egypt where we find the most extensive written records, the ability to write was never lost after its original development. That continuity is evident in the evolution of their scripts and writing systems.
However,
the amount of writing produced in these societies changed over time, and these changes often reflect broader historical patterns. The volume of written material is closely tied to political developments. When a state was strong and centralized, the use of writing increased. Royal inscriptions became more frequent and more detailed. Bureaucracies expanded, and with them, the volume of administrative records. Private individuals also generated more documents during these times, reflecting a more active and complex economy. This pattern holds true across much of pre-modern history. It's no coincidence that times of political fragmentation are often referred to as Dark Ages, a term that metaphorically reflects the historian's lack of textual evidence. As if the light of history has dimmed. In the eastern Mediterranean, in particular, the rise and fall of centralized power directly influenced how much writing was produced. The fact that written records became so widespread between the 14th and 12th centuries BC is itself a sign of the strength of states and the extent of economic development during this time. That's why the presence of writing is not just a helpful clue, it's a reliable way to define the time frame and identify the regions that belonged to the core of the historical world under study. Asterisk. Many individuals played a part in shaping the history of this period, and thanks to written records, historians have been able to recover some of their stories. But with few exceptions, most of these figures are only known within academic circles. A handful, however, are widely recognized, especially in connection with ancient Egypt. Ramesses II is one of the most famous, largely because of the grand monuments he left behind. His legacy has inspired films, exhibitions, and countless books, both academic and popular, especially since Egyptian hieroglyphs were first deciphered. Queen Hatshepsut is well known for ruling Egypt as a woman in a time of empire. Akhenaten stands out because of his radical religious reforms, And Tutankhamun became a global icon after the discovery of his richly furnished tomb in 1922, remarkably untouched by looters. It's no coincidence that these famous figures all came from Egypt, civilization that still captures the imagination. Today, through its monumental ruins and historical splendor, the rulers of other states in the region during the same era are far less well known. In fact, even the names of some of their kingdoms are unfamiliar to most people outside of specialized historical studies. To offer some clarity, I will present a general overview focused on political and military developments. This will highlight the actions of key individuals whose decisions often structure our understanding of the past. Extensive scholarly work exists on the histories of each individual state, including detailed analyses of their interactions. What I offer here is only a brief summary, intended to provide a regional perspective rather than an in-depth look at each kingdom. I will, however, use the Kingdom of Mitanni as a case study to show how the fate of one state was shaped by events. Across the entire Eastern Mediterranean, a note on chronology historians aim to provide date-side, delete precise ones. In modern history, we can often pinpoint the exact hour a critical decision was made. But the further we go back in time, the less accuracy we can achieve. Hours become days, then months, then years. In ancient history, we frequently have two. Usurka, as in Plato, was born around 428 BC. These approximations may be frustrating, but as long as we work within a clear sequence, we can at least build a reliable relative timeline. For example, Plato came after Socrates and before Aristotle. In this book, we must work with many different timelines, each tied to its own local chronology. Some of these are relatively solid, such as those for Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia, where we know the order of rulers and the lengths of their reigns fairly well. Other timelines are much more uncertain. For kingdoms like Mitanni and Elam, we know the names of many rulers, but not how long they ruled. In the Aegean world, we're even less certain. We often don't know the rulers' names at all. There, we depend entirely on archaeological evidence, which can only offer rough dating. Chronology becomes especially important when we try to connect different historical sequences and create a unified timeline across the Eastern Mediterranean. This is where we begin to see the weaknesses of each system. One scholar might say the Assyrian king Assurya-Bulit reigned from 1365 to 1330 BC, while Akhenaten of Egypt ruled from 1353 to 1336. Another might give Assur-Ubalit's reign as 1353 to 1318 and Akhenaten's as 1367 to 1350. These differences matter. When Assur-Ubulit wrote to Akhenaten as we know he did, was he a seasoned ruler addressing a younger counterpart? Or was it the other way around? The absolute chronologies we use are based on complex reconstructions, drawing on evidence that can be interpreted in different ways. For Egypt, it involves the Sothic cycle. For Assyria, various royal lists. The problems grow even more complicated for Elam, Mitanni, and the Hittites. Synchronisms of moments when the histories of different states intersect are helpful. For instance, we know Ramesses II fought the Hittite king Muwatalli II in his 5th year on the throne. But we don't know what year of Muwatalli's reign that was. The whole system of ancient chronology feels, at times, like a house of cards, carefully built, but fragile, despite the vast scholarship behind it. Still, it is an essential tool. It gives structure to how we understand the region's history. The system used in this book aims to be consistent, but it is not meant to appear infallible. It's a framework of convenience open to correction and improvement as new. Evidence emerges. Asterisk within this chronological framework, however uncertain, it's still possible to tell a political history of the Eastern Mediterranean. One centered on the actions of individuals, mostly kings and military leaders. My aim is to bring some structure to the many facts we know, to reveal a pattern, one of growth, flourishing, and eventual decline. Today, some historians view this idea of history following a cycle with skepticism, arguing that it oversimplifies complex events or wrongly compares historical periods to stages in a human life. And its true history doesn't repeat itself in a fixed pattern, but certain historical conditions do emerge, thrive for a time, and then vanish. Empires rise and fall. This doesn't mean things return to the way they were before, but rather that the imperial phase of a region's story has a clear beginning and end. In the eastern Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age, such a system emerged, lasted for several centuries, and then disappeared. It was surrounded on either end by periods often referred to as Dark Ages, times when the written and archaeological evidence is so limited that historians are left unsure even about the full span of years involved. Yet between those dark ages, there was a vibrant era of activity, innovation, and connection across the region. It is this period of high complexity that this book is devoted to understanding. A dark age in the middle of the second millennium, sometime in the mid-16th century BC. A student in Thebes, Egypt, copied down the words of a past king, Kamose, who had once voiced deep frustration over Egypt's fragmented state. At that time, Egypt, which had once been unified from the Mediterranean coast, too far up the Nile was. Divided, Kamose ruled from Thebes, but he had no control over the Nile Delta or parts of the southern valley. Even the region beyond the first cataract into Nubia was no longer under his authority. Just 150 years earlier, a ruler based in Thebes had controlled all of Egypt and even extended influence deep into Nubia. Egypt's unity had been impressive in the early part of the second millennium BC, but other powerful states had existed across the eastern Mediterranean as well. In the mid-18th century, Babylon under Hammurabi had united southern Mesopotamia. Aleppo had ruled over northern Syria, and Elam had governed a large territory. In central Anatolia, the Hittites had also risen to power in the 17th century, but by the early 16th century BC, all of these once great states had either collapsed or shrunk dramatically. Many of their problems stemmed from internal conflicts, but more severe disruptions had also played a role. What remained were a few scattered centers of power, each with limited territorial control. Much of the region had reverted to a more rural and unstable state. Cities that had once been major hubs of life and commerce were now abandoned or greatly diminished. Settlements had become more temporary, and long-distance trade had largely disappeared. With such a collapse in urban life and economic complexity, historical records dried up. The mid-second millennium left us with almost no written history. Only in Egypt and Babylonia was writing still practiced, and, even there, only to a limited extent. Despite this darkness, something new was about to emerge. From this fragmented and quiet world, a new and interconnected system would eventually rise. 1500 BCE, the first superpowers, Mitanni and Egypt's new kingdom emerging from the chaos of the mid-second millennium BCE, two powerful states arose on opposite sides of the Syro-Palestinian region. In northern Syria, the entirely new state of Mitanni took shape, while in Egypt, a reunited kingdom was established, what we now call the New Kingdom. These two rising powers were initially separated by the lands of Syria and Palestine, but their expansionist ambitions soon brought them into contact and competition. Mitanni remains one of the more mysterious powers of ancient history. Although it was a major force during the second half of the second millennium BCE, it is largely forgotten today. One of the main reasons is that we don't know where its capital, Washukani, was located. We know the name, and we believe it was somewhere in northeastern Syria or southern Turkey, near the Habur River's source, but its exact location has yet to be found. Because of this, we have no archives from Mitanni's core territory, no royal inscriptions, no king lists. Most of what we know about the state comes from outside sources or cities on its fringes. Nevertheless, the reach of Mitanni's power is evident. The royal seal of its king Sashtatar appears on tablets found across a broad region from the east of the Tigris River to west of the Euphrates. This shows how far Mitanni's influence extended. A key first-hand glimpse into its power comes from a statue commissioned around 1500 BCE by Idrimi, the king of Alalak, a city located in modern-day Turkey, about 50 kilometers west of Aleppo. The statue tells the story of how Idrimi, a younger son of an exiled ruling family, rose to power, though the account reads like a tale and shouldn't be taken literally. It highlights the authority of the Mitanni king Paratarna. Idrimi recounts that after years of being at odds with Mitanni, he reached out to Paratarna, reminding him of past alliances between their families. His plea worked. The Mitanni king accepted his message and restored Idrimi's family holdings. Idrimi swore loyalty to him and became the ruler of Alalak, where he would reign for 30 years. This episode shows that, by Idrimi's time, the Mitanni king had the authority to recognize and install rulers across northern Syria and even beyond the Tigris, though we call them Hurrians. The people of Mitanni are mainly identified by their language, which had been spoken in the region for centuries. Oddly, even in the Mitanni court, Hurrian was rarely used in writing. Babylonian, the dominant written language of the time, remained the primary language for official documents. The Hurrians had somehow risen to dominate the region during the earlier Dark Age and had imposed their rule over a wide area, forming a kingdom that came to be known internationally as Mitanni. During the early 15th century BCE, Mitanni held sway over a vast zone. From the southern Anatolian coast, west of Alalak, to territories east of the Tigris, and deep into the Euphrates Valley. It governed through a network of client kingdoms throughout northern Syria and Iraq. Mitanni's supremacy went mostly unchallenged until around Mitanni's 1350 BCE. Egyptian kings had conducted military campaigns in northern Syria during the 15th century, reaching as far as Carchemish, which guarded a strategic crossing of the Euphrates. But these raids never truly threatened Mitanni's core power. While both Egypt and Mitanni vied for influence over western Syrian states, they avoided direct confrontation. Eventually, during the reign of Egypt's Amenhotep II, the two powers formed an alliance, which was sealed by a royal marriage, a Mitanni princess. The sister of King Tushratta was sent to marry the Egyptian pharaoh, while Mitanni was building a new state from formerly fractured lands. Egypt was focused on reuniting what it considered its natural domain, Upper and Lower Egypt. As Kamos had complained in a previous era, Egypt had once been splintered between foreign and local rulers. Over roughly 150 years, kings of Egypt's 18th dynasty not only expelled the foreign, Hyksos rulers, but also began aggressive military campaigns both north into Asia and south into Nubia. Egyptian armies marched as far as the Euphrates River, about 900 kilometers from Egypt's traditional border and deep into Nubia, reaching the Fifth Cataract of the Nile, over 1,000 kilometers south. The Egyptian military must have been formidable, though the frequency of their campaigns indicates strong and persistent resistance. In Nubia, Egypt first encountered a unified kingdom centered around Kerma, near the Third Cataract. This kingdom had thrived during Egypt's earlier period of political weakness, although it likely wasn't tightly centralized. Once Kerma collapsed, opposition came from more scattered local groups who could retreat into the desert when necessary. Egypt annexed Nubia, as far as the Third Cataract, and placed it under a viceroy's control between the Third and Fifth Cataracts. The Egyptians built fortified towns and relied on cooperation with local rulers, cuing them into their administrative system. This control over Nubia remained mostly unchallenged for the next 500 years. Egypt's approach to the lands of Syria and Palestine, however, was very different. Although Egypt began its campaigns there at the same time as in Nubia, its grip on the region was far less secure. The nature of the resistance Egypt faced is unclear, but the enemies were broadly referred to as Asiatics, Alable scholars, linked to the Hyksos, the foreign rulers who had once controlled northern Egypt. One dominant Hyksos dynasty ruled from the city of Avaris in the Nile Delta. Amos, the founder of Egypt's 18th dynasty, attacked Hyksos cities like Avaris, then pursued them into southern Palestine and defeated them there too. He was the first Egyptian king in generations to push past Egypt's traditional borders into Asia, setting a precedent for his successors. For the next 150 years, Egyptian armies campaigned regularly in Syrio-Palestine to establish dominance. In the early stages, they faced little organized resistance from small city-states, but this changed. King Thutmose I eventually reached the Euphrates, only to be blocked by Mitanni's presence, though his campaigns expanded Egyptian influence. They did not eliminate Mitanni's power. Egypt maintained indirect control through diplomacy. Local rulers in Syrio-Palestine remained in place, but pledged loyalty to the pharaoh. This was a shift from earlier Egyptian strategies, which had focused on trade, especially with coastal cities like Byblos. Egypt had traditionally needed an enemy to justify its expansion, and that mindset lingered. Even Queen Hatshepsut, nearly a century after the Hyksos had been driven out, still spoke of them as enemies to validate her rule. Hatshepsut, however, is remembered less for military conquests and more for being a rare woman to take the throne as pharaoh. She ruled for 15 years as king in all but gender and commissioned monumental building projects like her temple at Deir el-Bahri, after her death. Thutmose III took full control and began 2 decades of intense campaigning in Syrio-Palestine. He presented these wars as responses to rebellion, targeting city-states and eventually the distant Mitanni kingdom. On his 8th campaign, he reached the Euphrates and also launched sea attacks on port cities in Syria. His efforts solidified Egypt's dominance in southern Syria and Palestine. However, Mitanni's influence remained strong in the north. Local rulers there stayed loyal to it. Eventually, during the reign of Thutmose, the third successor, Egypt and Mitanni moved away from hostility. 2 powers appear to have settled into a mutual understanding, dividing the region into separate spheres of influence. In the 1450 BCE, a second wave of state formation in the records of his military campaigns in Syria. Thutmose III proudly listed the tribute he received from conquered foes, but even groups beyond his army's reach sent him lavish gifts. Thutmose III treated these offerings as if they were owed to him, but in reality, they were part of a diplomatic exchange system meant to build friendly relations. Among the list of foreign rulers who sent gifts were 5 kings representing Assyria: Babylonia, Hatti, a place called Asi, and another known as Tanaya. This shows that by around 1450 BCE, specifically between 1456 and 1438 BCE, Egypt recognized the presence of other unified, powerful states in the region. Around the same time, local sources from those areas begin to appear, giving us a better window into their internal histories. Babylonia sent lapis lazuli, a deep blue, semi-precious stone from Afghanistan to Egypt after Thutmose III reached the Euphrates. The Babylonian king isn't named in the Egyptian record, but he likely belonged to the Kassite dynasty, which ruled Babylonia at the time. The Kassites were a distinct group with their own language, religion, and customs. They had entered the region earlier in the 2nd millennium BCE, and following the fall of Hammurabi's dynasty around 1600 BCE, eventually took control of Babylonia. By around 1475 BCE, a single Kassite king ruled a territory stretching from modern-day Baghdad to the Persian Gulf. By 1400 BCE, their domain had expanded to include the Djezala Valley and even the island of Bahrain. Though they didn't engage in major military campaigns, at least not ones we know of, they were still recognized as major powers. In diplomatic letters, even Egypt addressed the Kassite king as an equal. The Kassites transformed Babylonia from a patchwork of city-states into a unified territorial kingdom. Babylon became the true capital, and other cities lost their former political dominance, a major shift in the region's structure. Babylonia's most significant influence across the eastern Mediterranean, educated people adopted Babylonian language, writing, and literature. Babylonian texts were read as far afield as Assur, Hattusa, Imar, Megiddo, and even in Egypt, at Akata. Diplomatic correspondence across the region from western Iran to Cyprus was written in Babylonian cuneiform on clay tablets. Interestingly, the Kassites themselves adopted Babylonian culture almost entirely. Their own language and traditions faded from official use, and the art of their time shows little trace of Kassite uniqueness. Thutmose III also named 2 other foreign lands, Asi and Tanaya, though their exact identities remain uncertain. Many scholars believe Asi refers to Cyprus, and Tanaya might correspond to the Greek mainland, possibly an early term for the Danawi, later known from Homer as the Greeks. Both regions are difficult to study because of limited written evidence. Though writing existed in both places, it was used almost entirely for administrative purposes. Cyprus had the Cypro-Minoan script, which hasn't yet been deciphered, and the Greek mainland used Linear A and later Linear B, which recorded mostly inventory and bureaucratic matters. These sources rarely mention rulers or events, so we must turn to archaeology and foreign references for insights into their histories. Cyprus lies at the heart of the eastern Mediterranean and is easily visible from both the Syrian coast and southeastern Anatolia. As early as the 2nd millennium BCE, Cypriots were importing pottery from Syria-Palestine, and their neighbors were certainly aware of the island. Archaeological evidence shows that around the mid-2nd millennium, Cyprus experienced a period of social disruption. People abandoned settlements, and material culture became more regional. But around 1400 BCE, the island saw a resurgence. Larger, more uniform settlements appeared, and a shared culture spread across the island. It's still debated whether Cyprus was politically unified at that time or divided into smaller regional centers. One large city in Kami may have served as a capital. Cyprus was also rich in copper, which made it an essential player in the regional economy. Egyptian diplomatic records refer to a ruler of Alassia Kingdom, believed by many to be located on Cyprus, who controlled large supplies of copper. If this identification is correct, then Cyprus played a key role in international politics during the Late Bronze Age. The king of Alassia, who corresponded with Egyptian kings in Babylonian script, must have had an organized bureaucracy fluent in the dominant diplomatic language of the time, although we don't have much written material from Alassia itself. References from other regions show that by around 1350 BCE, it was considered one of the great powers. Later, in the 13th century BCE, the Hittites conquered the island. Not long after, Egyptians reported that Alassia fell to the Sea Peoples, a group of mysterious seaborne raiders who disrupted the region at the end of the Bronze Age. Around the same time, Mycenaean material culture becomes more prominent on Cyprus, suggesting a wave of migration from the Aegean. Cyprus's later history thus took a very different course from its earlier development. In the Aegean, Mycenaeans dominated mainland Greece and the surrounding islands during the Late Bronze Age. Their civilization is well documented archaeologically, but historical records are sparse. The mention of Tanaya by Thutmose III suggests that at least one political center existed in the region. Egyptian sources more often refer to Keftiu, which is generally accepted to mean Crete, and mention that its people brought tribute to Egypt. These records confirm that the Aegean had contact with Egypt, though they offer little in terms of historical narrative. Here, Hittite records become more useful. They refer to a group called the Ahiawa, located on the west coast of Anatolia and nearby islands. This name has appeared in documents since the 15th century BCE, though the Ahiawa only became politically significant in the 13th century. At that time, the Hittite king Hittay-Sili III addressed the Ahiawan king as an equal. A treaty written during the reign of Tudor England IV even listed Ahiawa alongside Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria as one of the major powers, though the name was later erased from the document for reasons unknown. Regardless, its inclusion reflects the high status Ahiawa held in the region. Tudor also launched a campaign into Ahiawan territory, capturing the city of Milawanda, likely the same as classical Miletus. The identification of Ahiawa with the Homeric term Achaeans, meaning the Greeks, has long been debated. Though not all scholars agree, the theory has strong support. If true, it means that the Homeric depiction of Greek involvement in Western Anatolia, such as the legendary Trojan War, may have some historical basis. More importantly, it allows us to connect the archaeological remains of Mycenaean Greece with written evidence from the time, confirming that they were indeed a powerful force in the region. From the archaeological record, we know that the Aegean was fully integrated into the wider world of the Eastern Mediterranean. Written materials from the region, such as the Linear B tablets found at palaces in Naissus, Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes, give us insight into the bureaucratic structure of Mycenaean civilization. The texts were written in an early form of Greek, using a mix of syllabic signs and ideograms. However, because these records are purely administrative, they don't provide names of kings or accounts of historical events. As a result, we must rely mostly on archaeology and foreign records to reconstruct the political history of the Aegean world. Archaeology has provided a detailed picture of political and cultural developments in the Aegean world between roughly 1600 and 1450 BCE. Two distinct civilizations flourished in the region, one on the island of Crete and the other on the Greek mainland. Scholars refer to these as the late Minoan and late Helladic cultures, respectively. Asterisk on Crete, the Minoan civilization was organized around a network of large, elite residences often called villas that resembled palaces in their layout. These were spread across the island, with Knossos standing out as the largest and most elaborate center. It's possible that Knossos functioned as the core of a centralized Minoan system that unified the island. Minoan influence spread widely across the Aegean during this time. Although it's hard to prove, later Greek historians like Herodotus and Thucydides believed the Minoans had a powerful navy that allowed them to dominate the seas. Asterisk, meanwhile, on the Greek mainland, a common Mycenaean culture took shape during the late Helladic period. This culture spanned southern and central Greece from the Peloponnese through Attica to eastern Thessaly. The archaeological finds at Mycenae best represent this era, but there's no evidence that Mycenae was the central political or cultural hub. The Mycenaeans were clearly ruled by an elite class, as seen in their richly equipped graves and the wealth of goods buried with them. Around 1450 BC, a dramatic shift occurred. The distinction between Minoan Crete and the Mycenaean mainland disappeared. Mycenaean culture came to dominate Crete. Following a sudden destruction of nearly all Minoan palace centers except for Naissus, it's still unclear what caused this upheaval. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans may have invaded Crete, while others argue the island's inhabitants may have willingly adopted Mycenaean culture after a period of internal crisis. The following centuries, the 14th and 13th centuries BC, marked the peak of Mycenaean civilization. Palaces built during this time were heavily fortified, reflecting the power and wealth of a militarized elite, particularly at sites like Mycenae and Thebes. The Grand Thalos tombs at Mycenae, famously though incorrectly named the tombs of Atreus and Clytemnestra, demonstrate the elite's control over precious materials and skilled craftsmanship. Throughout the Aegean, there was a high level of cultural unity. Mycenaean influence extended far beyond Greece, reaching Cyprus, western Anatolia, and parts of the Near East. Trade played a major role in Mycenaean society, as artifacts from their culture have been found in Cyprus, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and beyond. They also maintained contact with communities further west. Mycenaean pottery has been found in Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, and Malta. Politically, the Mycenaean world likely resembled the structure of the city-states in Syrio-Palestine. Palace elites oversaw nearby villages and managed a centrally organized economy. Linear B texts refer to rulers with the title Wainax, a term that roughly means king. The strong emphasis on military architecture, such as the massive Cyclopean walls at Mycenae, suggests a society deeply oriented toward warfare and defense. However, we still don't know whether a single supreme ruler united these palaces or if they operated independently within a loose network. Homeric epics later portrayed the Mycenaean world as a unified kingdom under Mycenae's leadership, but most historians today believe the region was divided into several small polities. Still, evidence from the Linear B tablets shows that there were connections between different palace centers. Elites from various regions are mentioned in records from multiple sites, and the widespread similarity of artifacts and administrative practices suggests that some kind of coordination or shared structure may have existed. If so, the Mycenaean system could have functioned similarly to the organized empires of the Mitanni or the Hittites. In short, the Aegean world, especially the Mycenaean part, was likely home to a major power in the late Bronze Age. Warriors, living in fortified cities, controlled much of the Greek mainland and islands, including Crete. They also had a presence along the western coast of Anatolia, where they interacted with the Hittites and others. Yet they were not the only rulers. In the region, on Cyprus, another king held power, and during the reign of Akhenaten in Egypt, he too was acknowledged as one of the great monarchs of the eastern Mediterranean world. 1350 BCE, the final three, Elam, Assyria, and Haddon, the eastern edge of the eastern Mediterranean world, a new state emerged around 1400 BCE that may have been just beyond the view of the Egyptians and Hittites. But it played an important role in the affairs of Babylonia and Assyria. This state was Elam. The region had been home to powerful states since the earliest days of urban life in the Near East. And during the 18th century BCE, its Mesopotamian neighbors had recognized Elam as the leading power in the area. However, in 1764 BCE, Elam suffered a major defeat at the hands of Hammurabi of Babylon, which brought its period of foreign influence to an end. For centuries afterward, Elam remained divided and weak. Around 1400 BCE, a new dynasty succeeded in uniting a large territory stretching roughly 400 kilometers, from the lowland city of Susa to the highlands of Anshan. These two cities became the foundations of royal power, as shown by the title King of Anshan and Susa, adopted by most Elamite rulers in the later 2nd millennium BCE. However, we don't know exactly how strong their control was over the areas between the two cities. While inscriptions bearing royal names help identify which regions were under their rule, we lack enough evidence from areas outside Susa to determine whether the countryside was fully integrated into the state. Still, based on written records, we can envision an Elamite state that stretched along the western slopes of the Zagros Mountains. From Susa, in the modern Khuzestan region, to Anshan, in present-day Fars province, reaching as far as the Persian Gulf. Unfortunately, Elam's political history during this period remains unclear until the mid-13th century BCE, as noted earlier, around 1450 BCE. Thutmose III of Egypt claimed to have received gifts from Assyria, located in what is now northern Iraq. At the time, Assyria was still a minor power. The kingdom of Mitanni dominated the region. However, Assyria gradually transformed itself from a small city-state centered around the city of Ashur into a major territorial power with increasing influence in regional politics. Our main sources are the royal annals, which tend to emphasize military campaigns as the cause of this rise, but diplomacy also played a critical role in Assyria's growing international status. Though it was often backed by military strength, the first important Assyrian king of this era was Assurbanipal, reigning from 1363 to 1328 BCE. He consolidated control over Assyria's heartland, the area known as the Mosul Triangle and the Tigris River Valley, reaching as far south as Assur. Before this, Syria likely functioned as a city-state, with Assur dominating only its surrounding area. During the 15th century BCE, it may even have been a vassal of Mitanni. Assurbanipal took advantage of Hittite pressure on Mitanni to seize control of its eastern territory. He then positioned himself as a significant international figure. In letters to the Egyptian king, he demanded recognition equal to that of the Mitannian ruler. This move drew an angry response from Bernabarius II, king of Babylon, who urged the Egyptian king not to treat Assyria as an equal, insisting that Assyria was his subordinate. Still, Assyria's rising power could not be denied. To secure diplomatic ties, Bernabarius II even married an Assyrian princess, Mubalit, to Cherua. Their son Karahardash was later killed during an uprising. Assurbanipal responded by intervening. In Babylonian politics, he deposed the new Kassite king and installed Kurigalzu II, likely his grandson. By 1350 BCE, Assurbanipal had firmly established Assyria's place on the international stage. The final major player in the region was the Hittite kingdom, known as Hatti, in the texts of the Hittites themselves and in those of the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Egyptians. Its capital was the city of Hattusa in central Anatolia, which has provided us with a large archive of written documents detailing political affairs. Reconstructing the history of Hatti, however, is not easy, especially when it comes to exact dates. The Hittites left no detailed king lists with the lengths of reigns, and even the reign of Suppiluliuma I, the great architect of the New Kingdom period, is debated with estimates ranging from 22 to 40 years. No event in Hittite history can be firmly dated without connections to Egyptian, Assyrian, or Babylonian timelines. Such synchronizations are rare and mostly come from the later stages of Hittite history. So, while we use estimated dates for Hittite rulers, they may need to be revised, especially if Egyptian chronology changes. The borders of the Hittite state constantly shifted. Its core territory was the central Anatolian plateau, especially the Halys River basin. Kingdom expanded mainly toward the south, eventually controlling much of Syria, even reaching Canaan. It's uncertain whether Hittite control in the north and west extended to the Black Sea or the Aegean coast, though these areas were geographically closer to Hattusa than Syria was. The Hittite state didn't function through direct administration. Like modern states, instead it maintained dominance over a network of client kingdoms and vassal states. As a result, the kingdom's borders were defined more by political loyalty than by hard boundaries. Throughout this era, the Hittites focused more on Syria than on the more distant regions of Anatolia, meaning the political center of the Hittite world was actually on its southern edge. The Hittite kingdom had a relatively short lifespan from roughly 1800 to 1200 BCE. It went through two major periods of strength. The first, known as the Old Kingdom, took place in the 17th century BCE. After a period of decline, the Hittites rose again around 1400 BCE during what's called the New Kingdom. During the recovery period, a number of little-known kings, too, of whom were named Tudor, gradually restored Hittite power. By the early 14th century BCE, the kingdom had regained control over central and southern Anatolia, including Kitsawatna, a key region on the southeastern coast that had previously been under Mitanni's influence. The Hittites also forced Aleppo, the dominant city of northwestern Syria and gateway to the southern lands, to switch allegiance from Mitanni to Hatti, in Syria. Hatti faced stiff competition from both Egypt and Mitanni. Egypt and Mitanni had previously clashed, but eventually formed an alliance around 1400 BCE to counter growing Hittite influence. Their improved relations are reflected in diplomatic marriages and a series of friendly letters exchanged between their courts. Egypt even tried to strengthen ties with Artsawa, a state west of Hatti, and proposed a marriage alliance. The western and northern regions posed significant problems for the Hittites. The Gazga people, who lived along the southern coast of the Black Sea, attacked and may have even destroyed Hattusa itself. In the west, a vassal named Matawata seized control of southwestern Anatolia and Cyprus. Despite these setbacks, King Suppiluliuma, reigning 1350 to 1322 BCE, turned the tide. Even while his father Tudor III was still on the throne, Suppiluliuma had already proven to be an exceptional military leader, ultimately built a powerful state that would dominate the political landscape of the region for the next 150 years. Suppiluliuma crushed Mitanni and pushed Egyptian influence back. He and his successors were central figures in the power struggles that reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean. After the emergence of these great regional states,